Welcome, everybody. We will get underway. My name is Ethan Hausman. I conduct business outreach for CSWD, and I've been at it for about 4 years now. Thanks for joining us for this morning. We're going to be talking, obviously, about backyard composting, and I will share a PowerPoint now to get us going. Okay, so hopefully you can see that now. And we always start by just mentioning a little bit about our organization, of course. So intro, and then the whys of why we are concerned about food scraps and why composting is a great thing to do. And then we'll review the 6 steps, which we will hammer home of backyard composting. And we have some demonstration videos that are part of reinforcing that. And obviously your Q&A, and that can be at any time, but certainly we'll allow time at the end for that. The best way to engage in terms of the Q&A is there is a Q&A box. And so rather than the chat, just use question and answer. I don't think there is a chat option. And you can also see in the tab that's answered questions what other people may have asked. But I'll be trying to answer them all live anyway. So that's where I'll be looking. Since we have a small group, I'm happy to take people off mute as well. So maybe I'll do that now, just in case people do want to be able to chime in. Okay, so if you'd like to take yourself off mute, you certainly can to interrupt me, and that's fine. Please do. Okay. So introducing our organization, Chittenden Solid Waste District. There are waste districts around the state. We are conveniently right along county lines, representing all the towns in Chittenden County, with a member of our Board of Commissioners, volunteer commissioner from every town, and an alternate. So we are Chittenden County officially, whereas some of the other waste districts are a town here, a town there, a little bit more of a patchwork. And one of the things that we're able to do as a municipality, because that's what we are, we're essentially like a school district. And so we're able to set some local rules. And so we call those the Solid Waste Management Ordinance. We also are helping educate people and enforce state law around solid waste. So Act 148, which is requiring us to keep our food scraps out of the landfill, is state law, but we are boots on the ground, so to speak, in making sure people know what they need to be doing that and how to do it and all of that. And we'll talk also a little bit about our facilities, because that's how a lot of people know us best, especially if you don't have curbside pickup of your trash recycling. You may bring it to one of our drop-off centers. So we have drop-off centers scattered throughout the county. Our one in Burlington is food scraps only at this point, but most of them have a wide range of materials they take, mixed recycling, trash, as well as lots of kinds of special recycling. Everything from natural wood to batteries and mercury-containing devices and scrap metal. Our Williston drop-off center is our special recycling hub. It's our sort of central point for special recycling, where we take the most kinds of items, including appliances and tires and so forth. Our environmental depot is our hazardous waste facility. It's behind the airport off of Airport Parkway. We're fortunate to have a year-round facility open to the public, and generally no charge to dispose of your hazardous waste, including paint, chemicals, and so forth, at the depot as a resident. Businesses pay, but residents do not generally. Materials recovery facility is, you may not be as familiar with, because it's not as public facing. It is where all the blue bin material, all your mixed recycling, goes to be sorted, baled, and then marketed. So we, in non-COVID times, we certainly offer tours of that facility, and I think I'm biased, but I think that's a fascinating facility to check out, sort of the behind the scenes of recycling and how it really, material gets to the processors who turn it into new things. And then Green Mountain Compost is our organics facility, where we are now seeing about 6,000 tons a year of food scraps that we are turning into a soil amendment. So we're really excited about some big changes that are happening there. Our process is evolving, and we have now a windrow turner. And so that's where all drop-off composting goes. And as we'll mention later, there's no reason why you can't be backyard composting and drop-off composting. They can complement each other very well. We'll get more into that later. So just to frame up why we're doing this because our landfill is not where we want our food scraps, and our quote-unquote local landfill is 75 miles from the center of Chittenden County. And so tractor trailers, and there are over 10 a day that need to make that trip to bring just Chittenden County's material to the landfill in Coventry. And there's only one operational landfill in the state right now, because nobody wants to host the next one, that's for sure. So those tractor trailer trips, more than 10 a day, are going about 150 miles round trip to bring our trash from here to where it can be buried for eons. So I'll ask you, just to give it a guess. If you take the population of Chittenden County and divide it by all the trash that we generate, so per person, pounds per person per day, and I'll let you sort of mull that over. We'll keep moving. So this does include stuff that's not necessarily generated by households. This, the number we're looking for will include like things generated by businesses and construction and demolition waste that you don't necessarily generate yourself, but we all have our share of that material. And then, as you can see, not everything that we're sending to the landfill, sadly, is trash. There is a lot of opportunity for us to be sending less stuff 75 miles away to bury it for eons. And so the black slice of the pie that you're seeing here is the trash that was, unavoidably landfill material, appropriately landfilled in Coventry. But that means that 47% of what we're sending to Coventry could have been put to higher use, diverted, not taking up space in the landfill. And as you see, the largest slice there is the organics portion. So that's mostly food scraps, but also includes yard waste, leaves and things. And at this point, none of that stuff is supposed to be in there. So the data that you're seeing is from 2019, before the law was fully implemented. And so we're hoping that slice is getting significantly smaller if people are doing what they're supposed to be doing according to the law and keeping that stuff out of the trash. But the fact that it's a quarter of the material in 2019 is one of the reasons why it's an important thing for us to target as an opportunity to divert that through composting. The other thing to keep in mind is that food scraps have a disproportionately heavy impact environmentally and in terms of the management of a landfill. We'll get into that. So there's your answer, 4.1 pounds per person per day. You may not see that in your own trash, like I said, because we all have to take responsibility for the things that are generated to be able to serve us, like at the stores that we are shopping at and so forth. But that's all part of what we generate here in the county. So why are food scraps so problematic? Why are they so impactful in a negative way in a landfill? There's your local landfill there. One of the reasons is because at this stage, as you see in the picture, all the material is decomposing, and to the extent it's decomposing, its outputs are not being very well captured. It is not yet like in a covered, enclosed cell where we can better ensure that the gas that it's giving off and the liquid that's dripping out of it are being carefully managed and contained. And those two outputs are why food scraps deserve our special attention, because the plastic wrap that we're putting into the landfill is not producing the landfill gas and the leachate the way that our food scraps are. The leachate, or garbage juice, is a function of the fact that food scraps are very wet and moist, just the way we are. We're mostly water. And so as they break down, they release that water. That water runs through all the other material in the landfill that's in some cases hazardous, certainly not good for us. We don't want it in our water. And so now that moisture that was fine from the food, was safe for the environment, is no longer safe for the environment because it's picked up everything else from the landfill, and now it needs to be managed as leachate, which means being brought to a wastewater treatment plant. So literally captured in in the landfill liner, pumped out through a pipe network into tanker trucks that drive to the nearest wastewater treatment plant, which is not next to the landfill. It's in the nearest urban center, Montpelier or Newport. So there's a a major trucking trip there too, and it's many trips a day for the 30,000 to 50,000 gallons of leachate that need to be managed through wastewater treatment. And then the other output is the landfill gas, and we can think of that as methane. It is mostly methane, and methane is a highly potent greenhouse gas. So we really don't want that going into the atmosphere to contribute to climate change. And so when the cell is enclosed, it is capturing that. It's not letting that out, because not only is there a liner to capture the leachate underneath the material, but there is plastic over the top as well once the cell is complete. And then there's a venting system that allows the methane not to build up and potentially create an explosion underground. And if it wasn't able to be used for power generation, it would be flared off. They would literally just have a flame there, as some old landfills do, to ensure the methane is not going into the atmosphere and is not building up underground. But in Coventry, we are fortunate that while Washington Electric Co-op does have generators on site there, and so they are using that methane to power homes, and that's great. Again, we're not capturing all the methane because the material is not immediately in the infrastructure you see in front of you on the slide. It needs to be it needs to all be put in there and then covered over with the liner and then with the more soil and so forth. And so what you can see is that a landfill takes a lot of management because you have to manage those two outputs, and you need a lot of infrastructure to do that with double plastic liners. That's just a redundancy to keep the groundwater safe, monitoring systems, testing to make sure that there's no leaks, and then the whole methane collection system of network of pipes and things. So what we do in doing that is we create a very enclosed tomb, essentially, with plastic on the top and plastic on all sides. And that's very good for protecting our environment from the stuff we don't want that's not good in the landfill for the environment. What it's not good for is promoting decomposition. So these are carrots that you're seeing in the slide in front of you that probably did start out yellow, not purple, but otherwise are pretty obviously carrots. And what's remarkable about that is that they were buried in a landfill for 10 years. They were, we know that because the newspaper that was unearthed from right next to them was still legible. And so we use this to illustrate that in a modern landfill environment, there is really minimal decomposition. There's just enough to produce methane and leachate, but not enough for stuff to disappear and for us to reclaim that landfill space right away. In fact, it will take years and years and years, decades. And so the landfill space is a reason to keep this stuff out, because we're not just going to be able to immediately put something else in there. In contrast, when we compost, we are intentionally making oxygen part of the process. Perhaps the biggest problem in terms of decomposition with having food in the plastic tomb is that no oxygen is getting in there. And oxygen, it's when the process of decomposition is anaerobic, lacking oxygen, that it produces methane as a byproduct. So if we can have those food scraps decompose in an aerobic environment where there is oxygen, like a compost pile, then we will produce some carbon dioxide, CO2, but that is not nearly as potent a greenhouse gas as methane. So we'll take that trade-off anytime. And so that's why the composting is better for the environment right off the bat, is that you're not producing nearly as much methane. We contrast the landfill carrots with these carrots that are part of an experiment conducted by my colleague Rhonda Mace, Recycle Rhonda, who does school outreach. And she thoughtfully put carrots into a mesh bag and then threw it in a backyard compost setup that you see there, that we were not managing like we manage our Green Mountain compost commercial facility or anything. It was just, it's basically what happened if you put your food scraps into a minimally managed backyard pile. And then she pulled that bag periodically and noted that, even after 2 weeks, they were less recognizable perhaps than the ones that were buried for 10 years in a landfill. And obviously by 9 weeks, you really have something that's essentially, soil or finished compost, certainly ready for your garden. So just to beat this horse, methane, avoiding the methane reduces greenhouse gas emissions. We're conserving the resources and the nutrients of the food. We're completing that loop there, just the way we do with recycling, and that those are precious resources. Then we can look at food waste that way. And then there's the landfill space piece, which people are probably most familiar with, because it is finite and precious, because we really don't know where our next landfill can go. And we just like to emphasize that while composting is great, we'd prefer to see people intervene further up this hierarchy, this inverted pyramid. So obviously producing less waste food is the optimal situation. So you're not wasting the resources that go into food production. And then obviously rescuing it, food recovery that's for feeding people is the next highest use, or the highest use once the food is overproduced. Feeding animals, and only then when those options are exhausted or not possible, does composting or anaerobic digestion make sense. Anaerobic digestion being another way to utilize food scraps for benefit. In this case, it's putting them into a sealed chamber where you intentionally create the anaerobic environment that will produce methane, and you have them produce methane in that sealed chamber where you can harvest it, where you can harness that methane and use it for power generation. So that's sort of like the opposite of composting in a way, but also a good way to manage food scraps. Just to quickly touch on terminology, we are often talking about putting things in the compost. So it's easy to think of what's on your kitchen counter as your compost. To be technical about it, what's on your kitchen counter is your food scraps, and they're going into the compost stream. So you have trash, recycling, and compost streams, but it's only the finished product, the soil amendment that you can add to your garden, that is truly compost. So pile A is food scraps and other compostable stuff, because I see maybe some yard waste, leaves, and paper towels there. Pile C is like plain old dirt, inert materials, more like ground up rocks and less organic material, whereas pile B, the compost, is all organic material. It's made from your leaves and your food scraps. So when we talk about organics, going back to the pie chart, we're talking about anything from plants and animals, and that really what defines what's compostable in general, like at a commercial facility where you don't need to worry as much about attracting animals and things. The rule is basically anything from plants and animals can be composted, and those are organics, so whether it's food scraps or leaf and yard waste. Compost is kind of special stuff. People know that it's good for plants and so worth putting in your garden, but I'm not sure that it's as widely understood why it has like the range of benefits it has. So it is biologically active, meaning there are microbes living in your compost, and that's desirable. You want, many bugs and bacteria are good, and that's certainly the case with compost, because they will tend to outcompete bugs and pests that you don't want, even fungi. So the biological activity helps promote a natural pest deterrence and a natural disease resistance. Because it is so absorbent and full of spongy organic material, it improves soil structure and absorbs a lot of water. It's a really good at sequestering water. And so it can be used as one of strategy in what we're dealing with in terms of lake issues, that there are, we have way too much phosphorus winding up in the lake, creating algae blooms that then close beaches and things. And that's because water is washing all the nutrients, like the fertilizers that are added to especially farm fields. Those fertilizers don't get absorbed into the soil and then get the next rain, get washed into the nearest waterway. Compost does a better job of keeping the rain, the moisture, where it lands, and they're also keeping then the fertilizer and the nutrients in the fields and not in the waterways. And then, of course, it's also highly nutritious stuff for plants. It's got lots of what they need to grow in ways that are in forms that are accessible to plants. So getting sort of into how we do it, composting, what makes it happen. We talk about FBI agents. And yes, this was first coined by our school outreach person to term it FBI agents because it works well with kids, but it's also a good way for all of us to remember fungi, bacteria, invertebrates are the composting critters. And in our commercial process, it's mostly fungi and bacteria because we're doing it on a concrete pad, and it's not, in direct contact with the earth. In your backyard pile, you'll be using all of them, and invertebrates certainly play a large role. And there are a wide range of invertebrates involved. Certainly many insects, but it's broader than that. So that's why we say invertebrates, because we include things like worms, mites and millipedes. And one of the things that you'll see on here that I find in my compost a lot are sow bugs or pill bugs. They're very helpful in composting. So basically, the art or the science of backyard composting is creating the environment that those critters will thrive in, making them happy, and they do the work. And that's sort of the beautiful thing, is that it's process happening all around us in nature all the time without anybody facilitating it. And all we're doing is trying to make sure that we're facilitating it as much as we want to sort of expedite the process and make it efficient for ourselves. So what do things need to survive? Air, water, food. That's simple. And I'll stop here and just see whether anybody has questions. I have, everybody is able to unmute if you'd like. So feel free to, or engage to the Q&A if you'd like. But I just give everyone a chance to ask any questions. Okay, moving on. So talking about water first, optimal moisture level for your compost pile, keep the critters happy, is not soaking wet, not dry and crumbly. So it's like moist, and that's 65% moisture. But what's the easy way to know is if it's enough to clump and not enough to drip. So the damp sponge, but not the dripping sponge. And then air obviously is going to get at your pile unless you're using a very sealed container. Some air is going to get to it anyway, but we facilitate that. Oxygen is very important to the process and is one of the sort of the limiting factors. If it's, if your pile never gets turned, the bottom is likely to take a lot longer to break down than the part that sees air. So there are a few ways of introducing air. One is through how you add the material by sort of layering it and using bulking materials like wood chips or even just pieces of small sticks and things that will sort of naturally create little air pockets. And the main way that you keep your pile aerated is by mixing and turning. And then food is your food scraps, obviously. That's what the critters are going to be feeding on, but they also need energy in the form of carbon. So food scraps tend to be very nitrogen rich, and we want carbon rich materials, which tend to be things that are, from trees. Anything woody is likely to be carbon rich. And so the obvious thing that we tend to have around a lot and most people use as their primary brown, so we call the nitrogen rich stuff greens, we call the carbon rich stuff browns, even whether or not all of it is really that color. And everybody tends to have leaves. So leaves are the most common brown that people use and work great. But even something like shredded paper, if it doesn't have a lot of other things, if you don't shred your credit cards in with your junk mail, or wood shavings can be good browns, even shredded cardboard. All right. So you're seeing a picture of our backyard demo setup there. So before we get into the 6 steps of composting, and I see a hand. So you want to jump in with a question?
Morning.
Morning.
So a lot of the takeout food containers now are certified compostable.
Right.
So would those be considered a brown? Like, could I somehow, break those down, and could that be considered a brown?
Well, Great question. So let me back that up for a second. So one of the things that makes it very confusing about compostables is that they come in various forms, and there are many things that look just like clear plastic now that are certified compostable that are made from a plant resin.
Right.
So those are
Right. No.
PLA, and those obviously are not going to serve as a brown.
Correct.
The fiber-based things you're talking about, meaning things that
Yes.
look like they're made from paper that's certified compostable. Yes, the paper portion of that would be fiber, which is brown material, and so that could be part of your brown mix. What I will just add to that a lot of certified compostable items are not intended for backyard composting. It's very hard to get. Backyard composting can be effective whether it's cold, whether you get higher temperatures, as we tend to get very high temperatures. We have to get high temperatures in our commercial process. That's hard to do in the backyard. Some people do get their piles up to temperatures that can break down some of the PLA, meaning the bioplastic plant resins. But generally, that's not happening. And so most compostables are best put into your, drop-off composting. The other thing to keep in mind is that sometimes there is a film of that bioplastic inside something that looks like paper. Sometimes a paper bowl that says certified compostable will have a PLA coating or a PLA lining that you can't see, because that's what makes it more moisture proof and grease proof.
Great. Thank you.
Sure. So as far as just sort of best practices or suggestions for how you collect in your kitchen, and many of you may already be, this may not be news to anybody, but there are a zillion different kinds of things, commercial products out there for your countertop, usually best put next to your sink, because that's often where you're scraping plates and doing food prep, cutting off your carrot tops and your potato peelings. But you want to find ones the right size for you. If you don't have a lot of space next to your sink, then get a smaller one that you empty more frequently. If you have plenty of space, maybe get a larger one. Although if it's too big, you're just going to find it starts smelling, before you run out of space. And that's what's going to prompt you to take it out. Some have carbon filters in the top. Some have solid covers. It's good to have a cover of some kind. The reason why some have carbon filters is to allow air in while filtering out the odors. I think it's less important to allow air in if you're emptying it, frequently. If you're emptying it several times a week, I wouldn't worry about whether air is getting in there, because it's not going to go anaerobic and start smelling in that time. But basically, things get smellier if they don't have oxygen. And so composting done well with plenty of turning tends to be not a stinky affair at all. But composting done poorly with minimal management can create a slimy, stinkier mess. You can use your freezer, obviously, as a way to keep things for longer. And in particular, I think that's a good strategy if you're going to do a hybrid. So for instance, you might decide you're going to do backyard compost and not want to put your meat and your bones in your backyard, which we can talk about why you may very well not want to do that. But the meat and bones can still go in a Ziploc bag in your freezer until whenever you have occasion to go buy a drop-off center and bring them in. They are, however, also allowed in the trash if you are backyard composting. That's actually an exemption written into the law, that because meat and bones are generally considered not appropriate for backyard composting, that the legislature actually wrote that in and said, if you're diverting all your other food scraps through that method, you are not obligated to keep your meat and bones out of the trash. Empty your food scraps at least once a week. As I was just saying, I would tend to try it more frequently. You can get away with once a week in the winter. I would not do that in the summer. You will have fruit fly problems and it will start to stink. But if your container does start to stink, vinegar can be a great way to rinse it out. And if you line it, some people choose to line it, some people don't. It's fine not to, and just to give it a periodic rinse. If you line it, you can either use compostable liners, which may not break down in your backyard pile or may not break down as well. So I would suggest the lining only for the compostable PLA liners that look like plastic but are green usually, only if you're going to be bringing it for drop off. And I was just using a paper, just like a paper bag from the grocery store is fine, to line it if you want a liner at home, because paper will break down really readily in your backyard pile. And even though it will absorb some of the food moisture and might get a little bit sort of saturated, at least it will help everything slide out of your bin, so you won't have as much residue to deal with in your countertop container. Okay, and getting more into the meat of what you're here to learn about today. 6 steps to composting: choosing a system, choosing a site for your system, collecting your scraps, forming your pile, letting it cook, sort of letting the compost critters do their thing, and then harvesting. There is a distinction that we should make here. We're going to focus mostly on backyard composting, but there's also a backyard or an at-home option for digesting, which is not anaerobic digestion, because there is going to be some oxygen involved in the process, and you're not necessarily going to be able to harness the methane. But it is a way to make your food scraps disappear and not have to be part of your life anymore. And that's usually the most common product that we see is the green cones. So it's a backyard digester. We'll talk more about what makes it different, but it doesn't produce any finished compost, for example. It just flushes your food scraps into the soil so that they're out of your life. And then for backyard composting, as you see, there are many different kinds of products. So what we sell are green cones for digesting and soil savers as just one basic container product. But there are many basic container products out there, as well as many different kinds of tumblers of a variety of styles. Then you can also make your own with pallets or many different things, chicken wire, hardware cloth, cinder blocks. And some people do the creative things like there's actually a small business. It's a gentleman, I think, who has taken plastic 55-gallon drums that are waste and reused them as tumblers. Put them on a metal rod so that they can forms an axle so that they can be turned as a tumbler. Very cool. So here the soil saver on the left. So that's what we sell essentially at our wholesale costs, which is why you might want a soil saver from us versus another. If you're going to just get a basic container, we might be the best price for something like that. You see they have hatches at the bottom where you can harvest from. Here's some examples of DIY. So even something as simple as a trash can that has holes in it so air can get in there can work for composting. I mean, people even compost that live like in very urban areas on their very small little, outdoor decks in a small container like this, or even something smaller. As I mentioned, pallet-based systems are very common. The one in the lower left, I think, is very cool because you don't necessarily have to focus on heat to compost. As I mentioned earlier, like cold composting will work and will break down. It won't break down certified compostable stuff necessarily, or all of it, but it will break down most food scraps, whether or not you reach temperatures above like regular ambient temperatures. But if you do want to try to expedite your process, heat is one way that helps. And so putting a soil saver that's black in a place that gets direct sun can only help accelerate the process. Or this person used a storm door, reused a storm door as the cover. So it lets all the light in and traps it like a window does, and pretty clever. I bet it gets quite hot in there. And I mentioned there are many different styles of tumblers. And so you see there's a spherical one. The one in the upper left is special because it has insulation inside it. So it's, I call it the Cadillac of tumblers, because it costs a fair bit, but is meant to retain the heat better, and therefore to go through more seasons of the year. As colder temps, it will keep going a little longer. In the upper right, you're seeing one half of like a clamshell style tumbler. That's on a store shelf, not yet assembled with the tops on. And some of them you turn the whole unit, and some of them you turn a crank to turn the unit. These are all mostly turning the whole unit, looks like. And so I just, before we jump into the steps in the videos, we'll just mention that there's a lot of feedback you get once you start separating your food scraps. So you may already have learned this because you may already be separating your food scraps, but if you don't, use it as feedback about what you're most wasting and what there are opportunities. Maybe you find that half a loaf of bread every week in there, and that's an opportunity to recognize that you really only need half a loaf at a time, and so you can give the other half to your neighbor when you get back from the store or what have you. Just be creative about reducing your waste and using it as sort of feedback. I mentioned the hybrid approach. I think that makes a lot of sense. Another way you can hybridize is that worm composting can be done indoors. And our Recycle Rhonda, our school outreach coordinator, is an expert on worm composting and does webinars on it if you're interested. So that's a great way to compost through the winter when your backyard pile is likely to freeze solid. Your worms can keep things going. But there are things that worms don't like. And so a hybrid, so composting in the backyard when you can, and worm composting indoors when you have to, can be a good way to go. And I mentioned also using the drop-off programs. You can always just bring us your food scraps, including the stuff that you're sick of trying to compost in your backyard. I mentioned meat and bones. You may not want to put in there because they can create smells and attract scavengers. But sometimes you just don't want to put the stuff that is stubborn in there. Corn cobs can be really stubborn, for example, or avocado skins. And so maybe you decide that you'll leave the stubborn stuff to our process where we'll hit higher temperatures and it won't be a problem. And then you also can your neighbors may have material. If you don't have leaves, I bet that somebody was looking to get rid of their leaves and would be happy to give them to you. But also businesses are getting rid of things like coffee grounds. So I know that like the Starbucks on Shelburne Road was very willing to fill up my 5-gallon bucket if I brought it in with coffee grounds, which can be a really nice additive to a compost pile. Or there are places that generate wood shavings. You need to make sure that it's natural wood shavings, but that's a great feedstock for backyard composting. And then of course, experimenting. There's a lot, it's basically a laboratory, your backyard compost bin in some ways, and you get the feedback and seeing what breaks down, what doesn't, what's quick, what's not. And so do experiment. That's part of what I find most satisfying about it, to be honest. Okay, and here we go into how to know where to put it.
So if you've decided that you want to pursue backyard composting and that's not your only option, there are other ways you can do it, like drop-off composting. But if you're interested in pursuing backyard composting, then you have some decisions to make about how you want to do it. There are 6 steps to that process of backyard composting, starting with choosing your system, choosing a site or siting your container, the materials you add to it, picking the right materials, building your pile, letting it cook down or compost, and then harvesting from it, using it in the garden. So starting with what container or system you want to use. You have a few basic categories as options. One example is our soil saver over there. This is a very basic system. It is just a plastic box. It does not have even a floor in it, in fact, but you can either put it on something like a piece of plywood, or you can just let it rest right on the ground. It is easy to open, but does lock down. So one of its features is that it secures from pests, and it is very affordable. On the downside, you will need to turn the material by hand, so it's a little bit more labor intensive, but durable, simple, functional. If you're interested in getting a little bit more creative, you can build your own composting system. And what we would recommend is a 2 or 3 bin system. And what you see here is an example of a 3 bin system made from pallets. You can also make these from virtually anything, including cinder blocks or hardware cloth, chicken wire type stuff, and stakes. These are obviously harder to secure, but it certainly can be done, as you see here on the bay that we add to. But often the benefit of these is that it's a rotational system, so that you're adding to one bay and you're flipping it into the next bay when it's ready. The next option you would have would be some sort of a tumbler system. And a tumbler system is different than a soil saver in that it is not directly on the ground. So critters from the ground can't get directly into it, but you do not need to turn it by hand. You just need to crank it, and it does the work of adding the air and giving the critters what they need in terms of mixing the material. Finally, you have a system like what we have up here called a green cone, and that is a digester, not a composter. And there are some fundamental differences we'll get into more, but it impacts the kind of materials you can use in it, and it has a lot of implications for siting. So we'll talk about the mostly limitations around under what circumstances in terms of available siting you can use a green cone. And in fact, we might as well jump into that now, since siting is topic number 2 in planning your backyard composting. So, what you need for a green cone is well-draining soil. So it really needs to be sandy or gravelly, and you can create that yourself if you're willing to do the extra work. Otherwise, you just need to have that in the area that you choose to dig your hole for it. It also really needs direct sunlight. It needs to be aided with the heat provided by being in the sun. And so if you only can find a shady spot, that is not going to be a good fit for you, and we'd recommend a composter instead. As far as siting a composter, you are going to want to think about how to secure it. You're going to want to think about proximity and convenience. The closer to be more convenient for you, especially in the winter, if you're going to have to shovel your way out there. But also keep in mind that there will be some extra fly activity around it, so you're not going to want it right up against your house. It also can attract some critters, although if you do it well, that's less of a concern, particularly if you make it inaccessible, like as the soil saver does with the clamp down lids. Always good if you can get it some extra solar by putting it in the sun as well. One more oft overlooked consideration when it comes to siting your compost container or even your digester, your green cone, is tree roots. There really is a concentration of nutrients that will be emanating from your composter. And unless your composter is off the ground or you have set on something, tree roots will have access to those nutrients and they will seek them out. They will actually grow from the ground, your composter, and add root mass, especially if you're not turning it regularly. So we would suggest not siting your compost bins exactly where you see these next to the woods. Avoid trees and shrubs when siting.
Okay. Questions before we, at this point, it's mostly videos, just to reinforce what we've talked about and to show you sort of the, us doing it on a demo pile. So I'd love to break it up with your questions if you have any. Okay, no questions. So as you saw, we're using a 3-bay system, but we have green cones and soil savers there as well. And the 3-bay system can be used either for, one bay can be storage of your browns, basically your leaf pile, or you can use all 3 bays and have sort of 3 stages of composting, and I find that continuous composting has never worked very well for me, meaning like, for example, the soil saver has the hatches on the bottom. And so in theory, you could be adding your food scraps to the top and then pulling your finished compost out of the bottom without as much of the raw food scraps there. The problem in my mind with that is that you want to be mixing it to get air to the bottom. And so how do you mix it without having your fresh stuff mixed in with your more finished stuff? And you can just screen out the less finished stuff. But I find what works better is just to have a full batch going and then adding my food scraps to some other pile while it's going. So with the 3-bay system, what you had been adding your food scraps to on one side, you flip over into the next bay and that becomes sort of second stage compost. And then you start adding your raw food scraps to the first bay where that material was. And similarly with the soil saver, I have 2 because I find it works much better than trying to keep the fresh stuff from the finished stuff. It's much easier for me if I just I'm adding to one of my soil savers while the other one is getting ready for harvesting. If there are no more questions, we'll jump into the next video. Cool.
So now I'm going to demonstrate how we use our 3-bin system, our homemade system. The 3rd bay, as we call it, is for our leaf storage. So that's where we store our leaves. So basically we're working with these 2 bays. We've cleared this one out sieved out all of the compost, and now what we're gonna do is this one's been sitting for a while. We've been filling this one up. Honestly, I mean, you would probably want to, or you want to fill it all the way to the top. It's just for demonstration reasons, we're gonna flip it halfway through. So we've got about a half a bay full. What I'm gonna do is I'm gonna flip it over into the second bay, let that cook for another year, and then next spring, check on it, see where it's at in the composting process. Hopefully we'll sift out some of the compost. Whatever the chunkies are left over, we'll put back into the system, and we'll just use bay 1 as our new compost pile to start building once again. So that pile will sit there for the next, till next spring, just kind of hanging out. I will check on it every so often, give it a little water and dry times. Right now, you saw with that squeeze test, it's looking pretty good. So right now it's looking fine, but I will check on that probably weekly or every other week until, winter hits. Adding water where needed and giving it a fluffle-duffle-do-ya every once in a while to circulate and kind of mix everything together. But that is flipping the pile. And now this bay is ready to start all over again with that layering of food scraps and leaves or whatever you're using for brown food. Ta-da! All right, so you've got the kind of compost system you want or digester. We've got our site selection. So the next thing to choose is, or the next thing to address, I should say, is what kind of stuff can you compost? Well, anything that comes from a plant or an animal technically can be composted. Mother Nature is composting all the time. And that compost, the finished compost, is what's going to feed your garden or your lawn or the trees in the woods behind me. Right? Compost is humus is the technical term for compost. Right? That's what Mother Nature creates, and we, because we're impatient, like to speed things up, and because typically we tend to be a bit wasteful, we have a lot more things to compost than, say, Mother Nature does. All right. So, what kind of things? Food scraps, all right? And we're talking backyard system right now. And so in your backyard system, when you're composting, we recommend that you don't compost meat, bones, and dairy, right? And that's not because they won't compost down. It's just because critters being like raccoons and skunks and even the crows, tend to hone in on those smells and visuals. So you don't definitely, you don't really want them in it. I mean, if you don't mind, go ahead. I'll be honest, I have always composted all of my food scraps when I've composted outside. So, except for raw meats and fish, I don't do that. But anything cooked, I just throw in there. So that's your choice. All right. When you're in the house, you can collect your food scraps with just about anything. Now, yes, can you get a fancy composter like, or food scrap collector like this one? Sure you can. And it comes with this cool little charcoal filter that kind of keeps the smell down. Right? I've had this for probably about 20 years, so this one's gonna stay with me. All right, because I'm gonna keep using it. But if you're new to the game of food scrap collection, you can use anything out there. And as a matter of fact, we recommend that you do reuse whatever you have in the house, all right? Because as you know, reducing and reusing is a more important step than even recycling, including recycling your food scraps. So here we've got an old ice cream tub. We've got coffee container. Even those little lettuces that you buy in the plastic containers can be used. And all of this fits very nicely right in the fridge, so you can keep those smells down as you're collecting food scraps, all right? Or this giant coffee thing. So again, you can collect in anything. If you want to collect at home and, or collect in your kitchen and then, take it to a larger bucket outside, which is what I do in my house, then you can collect in, you know, in anything. So here I've got an old Home Depot bucket that I had sitting around, and that's what I store all of my food scraps in until I am ready to compost them. All right, in a big batch. So, food scraps. So without food scraps, and as we learned earlier, those microbial friends, our bacteria and the fungi, and even the invertebrates, especially outside, so those FBI agents really enjoy a certain recipe. All right, so we're going to keep in mind 3 parts brown food, like leaves, straw, wood chips, sawdust, shredded paper, all of those little newspaper things you get in the mail. Shred those up and throw them in the compost pile. Why not, right? So all of those brown foods, you want 3 times as much brown food as you do your green food, all right? Green food being all of your food scraps, all right? High in nitrogen gives them the proteins they need to replicate. The brown foods, and today we're gonna be demonstrating with leaves, all right? Brown food gives those microbes the energy they need to get the job done, all right? So, now we've got our what we would call feedstocks, that's the technical term, but all of the stuff you need to build a healthy, successful, and delicious pile of food scrap, of compost. All right, so we're gonna use our backyard 3-bin system here. And we had already turned over our working bay, all right, our working side. This is the side that's gonna be cooking down. We'll talk about that in a minute. So how do we build this pile? All right, again, keeping in mind that 3-to-1 ratio, very important. Also keeping in mind 60 to 65% moisture is really critical, and probably one of the top mistakes I see in backyard composting is that people don't think that they need to water it. Well, like you, those microbes, they need water to survive. So what I'm gonna do here is I'm just gonna, we're working on building it. It's kind of like layering a lasagna, if you will. You'll hear the lasagna method a lot. All right, so I'm gonna actually just kind of dig a little ditch in the middle here, all right? Like such, with my handy dandy pitchfork, all right? This is Ethan's favorite composting tool, the pitchfork. All right, I've got my bucket of food scraps here. All right, it's about 3/4 full. And I'm just gonna dump all of that right in the middle, right like that. All right, then I'm gonna take my bucket and I'm gonna stuff it with leaves. How many buckets of leaves do I need? 3, because I have about a bucket full of Here's 3. All right, easy as that. Right like that. I'm gonna spread it out a little bit. I'm actually gonna use some leaves to throw around the sides too. I like to kind of insulate it from smells and attracting critters. And critters being, again, the skunks, the raccoons, all of that stuff. So, I'm just gonna use what's left in here to kind of insulate around the outside. Now, I tend to be a bit of a lazy composter sometimes, so I like to throw a few sticks and twigs in there. It creates air pockets for these guys to breathe. All right, so I'm just gonna shushle that around the outside a little bit. Give it a little insulation. All right, so now the last thing to do, probably got like a little food scrap stuck in your bucket here. Maybe you have running water out there. We do not here. So we got a bucket of water here. I'm just gonna give this bucket a nice little rinse-a-dinsel-do-ya. And I'm gonna pour that right over the top of my pile. Right like that. And this pile's pretty dry. So I think what I'm gonna do is go ahead and add a bunch of more water, even though it did just rain. And it's gonna rain later on this week. But because this is nice and open, it will dry out pretty quickly, and it's really windy here, so it'll dry out. You want to keep a check on that, all right? So we're ready to let that cook, all right, until at least the next time. So we'll continue to build this pile up. The bigger the pile, the hotter it's going to get in the middle. And as you will see from Amy McVeigh, she can get her piles up to 140 degrees Fahrenheit. All right, so then this middle pile we turned over, and this is cooking away in here. So this is gonna cure or cook away for maybe probably another year. So if you're looking for compost in like a year, less than a year in your backyard, it may happen. It may happen. I'm not saying it's not gonna happen, but it's probably not that likely, especially in an open system. And these are pretty large bays. Typically you want 3 by 3 by 3, all right? And fill it all the way up and then let it cook down. That will get the heat going, and that'll give that perfect environment for the microbes to start partying and go ahead and kick up that heat a little bit. So this is cooking, and I wanted to show you guys the moisture level. So we talked earlier about the squeeze test. My motto is always dirty hands are happy hands, so dig on in there. So if you dig on into this compost pile, and yes, it did just rain. Woo, look at that, Mac Daddy. So there is one of those FBI agents, the fantastical earthworm, all right, night crawlers. These are not composting worms, all right, don't confuse them, but they do like the compost pile because they're eating a lot of that broken down soil in there. So Ethan, can you show us what a perfect moisture or good moisture content in our compost pile looks like?
Sure. We're going to hope that this this compartment here has stuff that's a good example. So digging down beyond the leaf layer, there are more leaves on top to get a good mixture. We are going to give it the squeeze test. So if I can wring water out of it, it is too moist. If it retains its shape, it is just right. Let's give it a shot. Cannot wring any water out of it, but I certainly can make a nice compost ball.
Excellent. Thank you. So the soil saver, much like the homemade 3-bin system that we just learned about, pretty much, I mean, you're going to do the same thing. Only thing is this thing is nice and locked down, so you just want to twist the locks off. All right. Looks very similar on the inside. And it's a little dry, all right, because the soil saver does not come with these holes drilled, all right. I drilled those because we thought like it would help put rain in there. But you could always just like, if on a rainy day, just leave the lid cockeyed like that and let the natural rain come in. So you're gonna build the pile up just like you did with the 3-bin system. So I'm gonna get in here. I'm gonna just make a little hole, all right? Kind of just helps a little. Ooh, it's chilly in there. So this is my compost from home. And I'm just gonna, it's not very much. I'm just gonna put it in there. Now you'll notice too that I included some paper. I lined my compost bin at home with paper. So it's not as a hot mess to clean out at the end of the day. I also have some parchment paper in there, but I'm just gonna put that in there. I can cover this back up, all right? And because I added a little bit of leaves, a little bit of food scraps, I'm just gonna come over here and kind of guesstimate this is about 3 of those, or at least 2 of those, and just kind of spread that over. Now, to rinse my container out, maybe you have water access, I do not, but, so I'm just gonna give this a little rinsel-dinsel-do-ya, like that, all right? Right like that, and I'm just gonna pour it right in here, and that'll give it a little moisture, because remember, you want it to be like squeezed. So if you check this out, like if you dig down a little further, and I get in here, and I squeeze my compost, falls right apart, all right? Squeeze, falls right apart. That's not what you mean. That is way too, not enough moisture, all right? What you would rather is, maybe if we dig down deeper, it's nicer down in the bottom. We'll see. So what you want is Yeah, even that's too dry. The whole pile is too dry. So all we need to do is add a bunch more water. So thankfully, I brought a bunch with me. And so that's how I would be fixing this pile. Probably even a little bit more. I'd probably just be dumping some in there like that. Because if it gets too wet, you can always add more leaves just kind of to level it out. All right, so we're ready to go. Boom, done. Put the lid back on, snap it back down, nice and secure. There, you've just created your soil safer compost.
All right, there's collecting materials and building your pile. Questions at this point? Very quiet group today.
I have a quick question. I had to
Great.
step away for a second, so I'm sorry if I missed this, about building the pile and things you can compost. What is the verdict on rice?
Rice is fine.
Great. I don't know. I heard it somewhere and it's always been stuck in the back of my head. Okay, great. Thank you.
And rice is not one of the ones I often hear, but we get lots of questions about things that people have heard shouldn't be composted for various reasons. And many of those, when it's we're talking food scraps, are fine. I mean, in general, there are very, very few food scraps that would tell you shouldn't go in your pile. Meat and bones, obviously, and grease. Dairy, sometimes you'll find dairy lumped in with meat and bones because in large quantities, it can go sour and create odors and things. I don't find that people are generally throwing away dairy in large enough quantities for that to be a problem. And for me, if it's milk, it's liquid. I use it to water my pile and, it soaks in. And so I tend to not include dairy with that. Some people have heard about bread. It's true that, certain molds and fungus can grow on bread when it's composted, but that's fine. There's all sorts of fungi and molds and stuff that are part of the composting process. That's fine. You don't want to eat what's in your compost pile, but you're not those molds are not gonna be a problem. On that note, you may want to secure your pile, not only from scavengers, so you're not attracting raccoons, for example, around here, but also because if neighbors' dogs ever wander your yard, there are things, it's actually fungi that can be a neurotoxin. And so eating compost, to the extent that dogs are tempted to do so, can be quite dangerous for them. So that is one reason to secure your pile. We also hear sometimes about citrus because it's acidic, and that's not a problem. My citrus tends to break down great, even my half grapefruit halves, peels and all. I do find avocado skins are very stubborn, and avocado pits I have given up entirely on. They just don't break down. And same thing goes for things like seafood shells and things. They're just not gonna break down your backyard pile. Even our very heat facilitated process at GMC, we'll take seafood shells, but they're probably going to get screened out at the end. Things like that. What else do we hear sometimes? So in general, I mentioned the acidity of citrus and coffee grounds. Sometimes people worry about adding coffee grounds because of the acidity. So with coffee grounds, it should be noted that there's actually not as much acidity as people think because most of the acid is in the coffee and the coffee grounds tend to be more neutral. But one of the reasons why we don't spend a lot of time talking about the pH of your compost pile is because unless you're adding a lot of something that's very alkaline or very acidic that will throw it off, you can be fairly confident that it will hover in a close enough to neutral that it will be good for composting. You don't need to test the pH or regulate the pH unless you're doing something that could be throwing it off. And there are very few things that you could be doing to throw it off unless you're adding a lot of something that is. And so one example of that would be pine needles. Pine needles can be quite acidic. I wouldn't worry about adding pine needles to your pile, a handful here, a handful there. But if you're going to use them as your primary source of browns, if you don't have leaves, but you're using pine needles instead, then I would be concerned that you might end up with a pile that's a little too acidic for the compost critters to be happy in. Wood ash would be another example. That's in the alkaline side. So you'd want to be very careful that it was only natural, pure wood that was burned, because obviously the concentrates of any toxins are going to be high in the ash. But the other reason why you might not add wood ash is just because it might take your pile too alkaline. Okay, so I'll move into some questions that I'm seeing. Dry leaves only. No, any kind of leaves are okay. And one thing I realized I failed to emphasize enough was 3-to-1. Like everyone's concerned about putting their food scraps in their compost, but you actually want 3 times as much of the brown stuff that you're probably not as worried about. They're not trying to manage as much to create the right ratio for your critters to be happy. They need more of the energy source than of the protein source, the nitrogen that's for their replication. So 3-to-1. The leaves do not need to be dry. One thing you may have observed, though, is that often browns are dry material. Leaves are often dry, wood shavings, shredded cardboard. And so they tend to, and your food scraps tend to be wet. They're like 75% or more moisture. And so as they break down, they're going to get slimier. So keeping the right ratio tends to keep you in the right moisture zone too, because your food scraps are too wet by themselves. And that's why if you're not doing the ratio thing and paying any attention, you're likely to wind up with a slimy pile. The browns are too dry. Mix them together, you're going to be somewhere close, so you may need to adjust a little bit with water. And as you can imagine, it a lot depends on whether or not you have a closed system or not, as Rhonda was getting at. Soil saver without holes in the top, you might have to water more than an open pile in the spring when it's going to get plenty of rainwater, and you might have to be more concerned about it going too wet. Eggshells. No, I certainly don't rinse my eggshells. Eggshells are one of those things that are stubborn. You will find fragments, fine fragments in your finished compost for sure. They're not harmful. You can screen out your compost as fine as you want, wherever you're comfortable for putting in your garden. And the reason why you might have come across guidance to rinse eggshells is because it is true that raw egg can have salmonella, and then that salmonella could wind up in your pile, and then you could apply your compost to your garden, and the salmonella could wind up in your garden, and then if you weren't to wash your vegetables enough, then you could consume the salmonella and get sick. If that seemed like a lot of ifs and steps, it is, and that's why I wouldn't sweat it. I don't sweat it. So Rhonda will tell you that some of us who backyard compost do put very small amounts of meat. We're not going to put a whole chicken in our backyard compost, but the meat lasagna we scrape off a plate. We don't worry about the meat portion of the lasagna, for example. Rhonda would tell you she only does cooked meat in her pile because raw meat can have some of those pathogens. But same thing goes where if you're making sure to wash your vegetables, then that safeguard should be enough. And a lot of raw meat is fine anyway. So I don't even worry about that. But you may not want to do meat. But that's why there's the eggshells come up, is because raw egg can have salmonella. And so if they're not cooked, maybe you rinse them. I don't worry about it. Question about cutting up the food. That is one of the beautiful things about composting, is that it can be as active or as passive a process as you want. Some people really do not want to fuss with their compost. They just want to eventually be able to use in their garden, and they don't care how long that takes. And so they don't turn their pile very often. And, they periodically throw in a big pile of bunch of leaves, but aren't like adding the right amount of leaves every time they add their food scraps. And that's fine. And those people are not going to be cutting up their food fine, so it breaks down faster. However, if you want to be one of the more active folks and you want finished compost sooner, there is no question that cutting up your food will accelerate the process, especially if you target the things that are slower to break down, like corn cobs. Chop corn cobs up nice and fine, and you won't find them, that they're still lingering when everything else is broken down. Some people do, will use their food processor for a lot of their food scraps, and they get compost a lot faster. You're basically exposing a lot more surface area for the microbes to attack. So that's the way that goes. Cut grass clippings are fine for your compost. Just keep in mind that those are not a brown. So grass clippings are generally more nitrogen rich, so more of a green. So you need leaves for a brown. So how much sooner do you get finished compost? There's a lot of variables here. And for one big variable is if you can get your pile hot, if you can get to the point where you actually have the micro. So I also didn't cover that in depth. The microbes themselves create the heat if they're happy. They get more and more active. They replicate, and heat builds up to the extent that in our massive piles of green mountain compost, we're hitting 150 degrees regularly, and that's in the middle of winter. But those are very big piles with a lot of buffer on the outside, a lot of insulation essentially on the outside to keep the core temps. And so you'll never be able to do that in your backyard. You may be able to get some well above ambient temps, 20, 30 degrees above ambient temp though, in the summer months. And that will really accelerate your process. It would probably be enough to break down things like compostable liner bags, the PLA liner bags. I still wouldn't try to put something like, compostable cutlery or something, a dense piece in my backyard. But if you know your pile's hot, you could probably break down more stuff faster. You could definitely harvest by the fall if you started now. I find it works better to use the winter as a phase in my process. Like the winter is very good for softening things and sort of breaking them down initially, or for as a time when it can just sit and finish my process. And so I don't try to get compost done in under a season. I find it works really well to do it sort of on a year-long cycle. And so, have something that I've started adding to the previous year that's I'm done adding to by the time, late fall and winter hits, so that the winter helps to accelerate the process. And then sometime in the spring, around the time that I'm thinking about gardening, I'm ready to at least screen it and harvest some of what's usable at that point. But yeah, if you're chopping up all your food and doing everything by the book and really taking an active role, I think you could definitely do it in a 6-month season. Do we have other questions? Yeah, so I mentioned regulating the moisture can really depend. You saw us adding a lot of water in the video, but I find often I'm not adding water in my backyard pile. I have, the food scraps are so moist that with a covered soil saver, I don't have to add a lot of water. But certainly regulating the moisture is one of the places where we see people go wrong, often going to the slimy side, and that's where it gets more anaerobic. So it's going to be slower, it's going to be stinkier and slimier if you don't add enough browns, for instance, dry browns, to keep your, so your stuff winds up too soggy. But that's usually how you can bring it back. If you wind up too soggy, adding more browns is usually the quick save. And in most cases, nothing you can do to throw your pile off so wildly that you can't just add something, get it back into balance, and finish it up. The only place that you can really go real wrong and need to start all over again and toss the material would be as if you were to add paper towels that you'd use with cleaning solutions and things, because obviously those antibacterial agents are going to kill the bacteria that you are trying to help thrive. So paper towels are great material to include in your compost. They'll break down really quick, just like any paper will. But be mindful what you use them for. Food, beverages only, water, not cleaning agents. And I think I mentioned earlier that winter, you will need a very large pile, bigger than any soil saver, probably bigger than anything you'd even create as a pallet-based system, a 3-bay system, to retain temperatures in the winter that you can maintain through the winter. You just don't have the mass in a backyard pile unless you go really big to have the insulation on the outside and keep the core. So be prepared to just, you can add to it, but it's just going to sit there frozen solid, and that's okay. You can layer it so that it's more likely to sort of be ready to go and not be a frozen, a big sort of lump of slimy food waste if you layer with leaves as you add in the winter. But don't expect it to keep going. It will just start back up again as the temperatures warm up. Okay, we have a harvesting video to watch. We'll jump into it.
So, now that you've let your pile cook down, and again, it might take like a year or so, maybe 2 years, depending on how hands-on you are, or how happy your microbes are. So now it is time to harvest. So we actually sieve out our our compost so that we can throw the chunky monkeys back in to continue composting, or the leaves that are covering up the pile. Now this pile hasn't been cooking very long, so we're probably gonna have a lot of chunky monkeys in there and definitely a lot of leaves. So don't base it upon this. This is just kind of a new pile. So I think this is started in probably like October of last year. So obviously not composting much over the winter. So we have made a sieve out of old 2x4s and some hardware cloth. You can do it however you want. This is the time to engineer, guys. All right, get on those engineer hats. So we're gonna dig down in here, and we're just gonna throw it on here. Now it did just rain, so this is like really wet stuff too, but and as Ethan said, sighting it along a tree line is not the wisest thing, and that's just because I just dug into a bunch of roots as well, because they're just coming up and eating it. So you can just move this all over the place like this. The bits of finished compost will fall into your wheelbarrow, or I use a tarp actually at my own house, because I actually compost with worms, so it's a little different. And all right. And typically you wouldn't do this when it's like saturated and wet like this, but sometimes you just got to take opportunity where opportunity lies with the weather these days. All right, so like I said, this isn't cooking down all that long, but we're gonna we didn't get much out of there. But we did get, that is the finished compost right there. All right, and I can see some things moving around in there. Oh, there's a little spider, so don't be afraid. It's all fine. They're all compost critters, all right? They're all our friends. All right, so this stuff is ready to go on your garden and feed those bean plants, feed those spinach plants, or even your flowers. Now, harvesting from the soil saver is very similar, except you got a little door right here. And again, I don't really know what to expect in here. So you've got a little door and you can just kind of shovel it out from underneath. Oh, look at that. All right. Ha. That actually looks pretty darn good. So there's some eggshells in there. Is that gonna hurt your garden? Absolutely not. They will break down eventually, all right? So don't worry if there are little pieces of food still left in there uncomposted. You can just turn that right into your soil. It's really not that big of a deal. So that is Harvesting 101.
Okay. So that's harvesting. And so as you see, the soil saver does allow you to pull out from the bottom. It's just harder to keep your stuff separate. You know, from your food scraps you've more recently added. So I do 2 soil savers. That also is a good, going back to winter time, you know, that's when you're most likely to run out of space because everything comes to a halt. So the food scraps you're adding are just building up in there. If you're really concerned about capacity, maybe you don't add the leaves until the spring when things are starting to work again, so that you don't run it, you're less likely to run out of space. But my solution is just to have a second soil saver, which then allows me to be adding to one while one is cooking. One of the reasons the pitchfork is nice for a couple reasons. One is that it's a lot easier to get it into the material. Like it penetrates better than a shovel does with the tines. But the other reason is that you can give it some stabs instead of having to do a lot of turning. You know, so the lower effort way to add air is to stab it a few times, and that's especially good if it's like colder temps, but your pile has been getting hot. If you've actually been getting some heat in your pile and you don't want to ruin that by like doing a major turn and losing all that heat from the inside, stab it so that the core remains hot, but you're still introducing air. So that's why the pitchfork was a bit of an epiphany for me when I started using one. Other questions? Nothing? Okay. Trying to think if I have any other notes of things that we should cover. No, I don't. So at this point, one thing I'll mention is that someone who recently watched one of our webinars was a little bit dismayed at how little compost came out of our sifting or screening process in the demo here. And it's true, not much compost, but I would also say that if this were my backyard pile, I wouldn't have been screening at that point. I would have recognized that it was mostly leaves in there and that it needed more time if I was actually going to get a decent yield. And so we were harvesting at that stage for purposes of being able to do the demo video. But normally be a little bit further broken down. Although you can choose how eager you are to and willing you are to like do a lot of screening for a little compost versus letting it go longer and having less to screen out. And some people don't do screening at all. Some people add it right to their garden, and that's fine. It's all that sort of comfort level kind of stuff. So the only other thing that we could cover is the green cone in more detail. And so just to highlight the differences once again, green cone is a digester rather than composter. It's a little more involved to install because it has to be sunk in the ground. You actually install a basket below grade in a hole. It is very sensitive to siting considerations. So you have to have the right conditions, place to put it if you're going to think about doing it. Because it needs to be in direct sunlight and needs well draining soil around it. You can create sort of a, with gravel, you can create sort of the draining soil around it if you're committed to doing that. But I wouldn't suggest using it if you don't have those conditions. And then it doesn't take yard waste. It doesn't take any browns. So it's really just for your food scraps and you don't harvest from it. It just makes your food scraps disappear. So we do have a video on the green cone and and installing it if anyone would like to watch that. So by all means, let me know in the Q&A or chime in if you'd like to watch green cone video. But we've started to not show that as a regular part of these because we find that it's much more of a niche interest, and that most people are interested in being able to use compost in their gardens and doing the full process. Okay, it seems like we have no more questions. So I will thank you once again for joining me on this Saturday morning. Appreciate your learning about backyard composting. We are here to help you and answer questions, whether that's giving us our hotline a call Monday through Friday, 8:30 to 2:30, or shooting us an email, or even on social media. But we're happy to field questions about backyard composting and wish you well with it. It can be a very gratifying thing to do. Thanks again for joining us, everyone.